Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Fight Club and Close Calls. Both of these movies you could say that you've seen on a app. They're in fact called Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service that at the end of the day, you could say that you've seen any number of things by going on into this app service. Not getting any money for saying it, but at the end of the day, I just wanted to say, hey, you could go to certain apps, find some things, some stuff would ultimately say go ahead and do it at the end of the day if you want to see either one of these films. So ultimately, let's talk about this thing called Fight Club because ultimately we're going to break the two rules today and ultimately say that we've seen this movie quite a few times. Ultimately, we've seen Close Calls twice now, and so ultimately at the end of the day, bleep bleep bleep. That's all, folks. If ultimately you have seen Fight Club, you know all about it, then at the end of the day, you could fast forward to the point where I switch to talking about Close Calls. Kind of an interesting film, kind of a. There's some interesting visuals for especially a lot of guys that are otherwise going to be watching this review. But realistically, it may not be the greatest story of that you've ever heard in your life. But again, it's ultimately just a very kind of interesting journey that this movie goes into. And ultimately, I was just like, you know what? Like, I just saw this like scrolling through the app, and there, in fact, I'm like, hey, let's watch this again because I just thought it was an odd movie when I watched it the first time around. So let's ultimately talk about Fight Club. So Fight Club to me ultimately, uh, I remember a while ago, a while like very long periods of time ago, I ultimately had never seen this movie. I never really quite understood what this movie was. Ultimately, I just assumed, from what I remember about this movie, it being a shirtless Brad Pitt movie at some point, and ultimately there were like women and some sort saying, "Ooh, wow, Brad Pitt shirtless. Ooh, that's great." And so ultimately, that's where I'm like, I don't want to see Fight Club. Like, I don't think it's gonna be that interesting. Like, meh. I don't know. I don't think I'm gonna get anything from this movie. And so, surefire enough, I ended up just eventually buying like a copy of the movie at some point, and I finally sat down and watched it. And after watching it, like I couldn't not stop going back into it and watching it again to the point where I think once I finally saw it, like I think I saw it like 50 times after that, just because I really enjoyed it. Um, just because it was one of those where I was just like the concept was very interesting to me, and the overall just approach to the film, the escalation that the film eventually goes into, I was just kind of really intrigued by, and I was just really impressed. So ultimately, I enjoy this movie, and I don't really dare say anybody who has a negative thing to say about Fight Club. When looking at it, it comes from a point of kind of giving you these like I would call them like words of knowledge or things to live by, or justifiably like a number of people have probably quoted any portions of this film through any other kind of different kind of uh, mediums of sorts of things. Ultimately, at the end of the day, to go through and talk about this film once more. Uh, Really even knowing guys like Jacksepticeye have quoted Fight Club at some point. Game Grumps has quoted Fight Club at some point, and so on and so forth. A lot of the big YouTubers at some point have quoted Fight Club at some point, probably even PewDiePie. So, not saying that there aren't other YouTubers that are just as big as those people that have said that. I'm just coming up with a bag of references. A bag of references. So, going into this movie, I really enjoy it. Uh, I don't care how many numerous times that I've seen this movie. Every single time, it feels like it kind of feels like the first time to me. Not just because I completely try to forget the last time I watched it. It's like every time I watch it, it just feels like um, you're always looking around heavily within this movie to kind of see what you've missed, and so that's what I think it. That's why I think it always makes for a new experience. Uh, but yeah, so anyways, going on to this film, of course, this film was, of course, done off of a novel, which is kind of funny. When looking at this, I'm like, man, like, and ultimately knowing full well that there is a Fight Club 2 comic book, which ultimately I'd read quite a bit of, and I didn't really quite enjoy the ending of it. I was like, meh, I didn't enjoy the ending of Fight Club 2. Ultimately, that's where to have naturally assumed that they were never actually going to make a sequel to this movie, just because reasonably the sequel would have just ended with a yeah, hey, we're never gonna make another one of these. We're never gonna make another kind of movie like this because it wouldn't make sense. So going into going into Fight Club, I just really enjoy the film, and I think that's all I'm gonna go out of my way to say. Because ultimately, it'll take a much longer time to talk about this movie and describe it and whatever than reasonably and or rationally to talk about it in a very cryptic like sense. So to me, this is a great movie. Ultimately, to the point of I have it very high on I think my top 10 list. Heaven forbid I know what number that is of where it sits on my top 10 list. But probably ultimately, I believe it should be pretty high for justifiably how many numerous times I went out of my way to go back and watch this movie. So let's go into that sweet double five count to ultimately, after that amount of time, spoil this movie. I am probably going to go through this one and legitimately kind of quickly go through this one because ultimately, when looking at it, uh, like I think a lot of people have heard of this movie or reasonably at this point. Like there's only like there's big parts to really try and have people know about this movie, but other than that, it's just a bunch of fighting. So, and I'm ultimately gonna try to eschew this like give a cleaner variation of this movie because there are some parts where it reasonably kind of dips into the not so PG portion, I guess, of how I would try to review things now, because trying to get out of my way of reviewing things in PG. So, anyways, or a PG ash like way. So, anyways, let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I get spoil this movie. So, ultimately, when I switch to close calls, ultimately I might pause here to just kind of adjust to do some IMDb shifting and whatever. So ultimately, if there's an actor that I have to look for, or there's a character name that I have to look for, then ultimately I'll be able to find that quite easily when I do the other movie. So, Fight Club. Spoilers. So we have it to where ultimately, weirdly, I had just seen the movie Cashback, and like watching Fight Club and watching that the time before, the day before or whatever. I can't help but like really look at this and that movie visually, and just like there's a lot of similarities with story and whichever. But anyways, that movie has more girls that are unclothed than this movie. So check out that review if you want to. But anyways, so we have it to where Fight Club. So we have a main character who is focused in this movie that never has a name. It never comes up. Ultimately, a lot of the times, Edward Norton's character is just called the narrator. You could ultimately have him be called any number of names, like Cornelius, or you could ultimately call him uh, Jack, because ultimately that's the name that they ended up giving uh, Edward Norton's character in the Fight Club video game, was they just called him Jack, bizarrely. So we have it to where uh let's just call him Cornelius, I guess, to just kind of ultimately just have him have a name. So we have Cornelius that ultimately is a person that is a guy who tends to fly to ultimately he ultimately flies from place to place to ultimately see if he needs to do recalls on certain automobiles. Ultimately, he works for a major automobile company that they have to make assessments on whether or not to make recalls on certain things. If ultimately it seems that uh, if ultimately it seems like after doing the math that there is no real justification for doing a recall, they don't do one. So if there seems to repetitively be like a certain accident with a certain portion of car, and ultimately someone won't recall it just because it's like, well, like this only affects like 10% of the world, then they just won't recall it. But anyways, so we have it to where Edward Norton's character is ultimately just kind of a seemingly person that frequently flies. Ultimately, while also flying, he is also a person that doesn't seem to be able to sleep at all. Really, very much the opening of this is we kind of find out that Edward Norton's character is a person that has to justify his life by really just justifying furniture to justify his life, by justifying the clothes that he wears or the suitcases that he has, or and everything is to him is like, oh well, I have to buy the perfect set of plates. I have to buy the perfect table that represents me as being a consumer that ultimately just tries to find the perfect thing that ultimately is uh, to overall just like when you're coming into my apartment, ultimately you're seeing me throughout the entire thing. Which ultimately I can understand that. I can understand like if you have a room of your own, how you ultimately want to have it like represent you and stuff like that. Like for me, like plastering posters on walls and stuff like that ultimately would be a kind of thing to just try to like be different or whatever. Um, but anyways, so we ultimately have Edward Norton's character that is a consumer of sorts that ultimately he knows what a duvet is. It's a comforter. So we happen to have it to where uh, Edward Norton eventually goes on into repetitiously going from plane to plane to plane, ultimately not realizing uh, like where he is, what time zone he is, and so on and so forth, and to the point where he gets utterly confused, and to the point where he like cannot sleep either because ultimately it's just like if you're so razzled and whatever, it's like it's impossible for you to be able to sleep. So we have it to where this character ultimately goes into not being able to sleep. Ultimately, we have him push on to seemingly trying to find a doctor that ultimately is to quite possibly help him sleep. And the doctor is like, no, like, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to give you any kind of medication. If anything, the only medication that I can give you is for you for just to tell you to just get natural sleep. So we have it to where Edward Norton's character is ultimately told at the tail end of this conversation. It's like, hey, with this doctor. It's like, hey, if you want to know real pain, it's like check out the guys that are in the this meeting for testicular cancer. So we have it to where Edward Norton eventually just goes to this meeting just to check it out, and then ultimately he realizes that it's like, hey, this is actually pretty like this is bizarrely to him pretty nice. Like ultimately, you have it to where it seems that we have Edward Norton's character ultimately going into the this testicular cancer meeting, and ultimately they have them hug it out, and ultimately they have one talk. They have one another talk to one another as they're hugging, and we have it to where ultimately that's where we meet Robert Paulson, ultimately a man that ultimately has pecs that are abnormally large, to the point to where it seems like he has uh, a woman's chest of sorts. Let's just say. So we have it to where uh, uh, we have we have Cornelius hugging on to Robert Paulson, and ultimately we find out that Cornelius has ultimately found some kind of peace with going to these meetings, uh, getting to the point where he is ultimately just like he's found his ability to sleep. He like ultimately him going to these meetings, hugging people and crying, or hugging people and just talking to them ultimately has given him the ability to be able to sleep. um to ultimately eventually that will get completely ruined by Marla Singer. Ultimately, Helena Bonham Carter, who I've seen in a number of Tim Burton-ish Johnny Depp films in my life, but ultimately knowing her full well for being in this movie. So really just pushing on. So we have it to where ultimately Cornelius goes to every single one of these meetings, even though he is having absolutely no ailments of sorts, going through every single meeting that is basically going to say that eventually he is going to die at some point, but he's really not. He's just ultimately coming in there to be comforted by people, and ultimately coming there to ultimately be able to talk to somebody because reasonably no one cares. Um, we ultimately have it to where Marla Singer is going to every single one of these meetings, uh, like like Cornelius is, and to the point where we have it to where Cornelius is just getting annoyed with this because he's like God, like her lies reflecting my lie. Like she's a faker, and ultimately I was here first, so like I'm gonna call her out on this that she's a tourist and I hate her, and ultimately like she's just like God, she's so she's so utterly like we have this guy that is just like he can't concentrate. He can't get his spirit animal, which was a penguin. Ultimately, that is all ruined because ultimately his spirit animal is now Marla Singer. We ultimately have it to where we have I think her name is Chloe. Ultimately, go up and talk about her seemingly being at the tail end of her life, and ultimately the one last thing that she wants to do is sleep with somebody, and ultimately she's offering all these like all these things that she has and they kind of just cut her off. um so we have it to where pushing on, so we have it to where eventually Cornelius is going to Marla and finally confronting her, uh, finally wanting to tell her off. And so we have it to where, like, at first it is kind of funny how, like, in Cornelius's mind, how this is going to work out, how he's just going to grab her and just, like, throw her around and whatever. And, like, it looks really funny when he is thinking how well that is going to go, but it's not. So we have it to where ultimately Cornelius does go and eventually approach Marla, and is ultimately just yeah, like I don't like that you're here. Like you've been in like every other kind of meeting that I've been in, and like I can't cry and I can't do what I need with you here. Like I can't be here with another faker here, and or I can't do what I need to do with another faker here. And so ultimately, like we need to just figure something out. Ultimately, they have to ask one another why exactly they do this. Marla just goes like, "Well, like, it's better than a movie, and the coffee's free." And ultimately, Cornelius does it because ultimately, when people know you're dying, it seems like they are willing to hear what you have to say rather than just kind of waiting for them to ultimately start to speak. So ultimately, we have it to where they go and they exchange meetings, which meetings they want to go into. It seems that Marla wants the testicular cancer one, and because ultimately she has her or she doesn't have balls and he does, so ultimately that is what gives her the right to be able to go there. And so they're going through this, and ultimately Marla is ultimately kind of she's selling her clothes to a thrift store as she like just took them out of a dryer. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. So we eventually have it to where they exchange which stays they want, but ultimately, Cornelius ultimately exchanges numbers with her because ultimately they might switch days or ultimately something might happen. So Marla ultimately says, it's like, well, what is your real name? Is it Cornelius? Is it Travis? What is your real name? And we never really come to that consensus. So pushing on. So ultimately we have it to where it seems things are seemingly going well, and we have it to where eventually we have it to where Cornelius is ultimately on his way onto a plane to meet an interesting character, a guy named Tyler Durden. So we have it to where we find out that ultimately Tyler is a person that ultimately makes soap, and ultimately we find out that Tyler ultimately, we have it to where Cornelius is talking about single serving people, and we ultimately have him talk about airplane conversations and ultimately how short and brief they are, and how you're dying 1 minute at a time, stuff like that. And now that he's with Tyler, ultimately Tyler is kind of at some points kind of making fun of Cornelius, but when looking at it, because ultimately he kind of talks about how he has a sad desperation in his laugh. Um, but ultimately we have Cornelius who's trying to be as clever as possible. To ultimately, Tyler has to award him that trophy of, oh, you're the cleverest man on this plane. Because ultimately, we have it to where Tyler is right by the exit door, and ultimately he's going through the airplane manual or pamphlet or whatever, ultimately mentioning that he is close to the exit door, and ultimately he is looking at the thing of like, well, if you are close to the exit door, uh, like you have a responsibility to, if the plane were to crash, to help others out of the plane. Like, would you want to have that responsibility? And Tyler's like, oh yeah, I guess I am right by the exit door. And so he's looking like, hey, well, do you want the do you want the exit door? And ultimately, Cornelius is like, no, I don't think I want that kind of duty. And ultimately, Tyler has to mention uh, how the reasoning is of when they have uh, oxygen uh, masks on planes, because ultimately it's like, oh yeah, it's just to help you breathe. It's like, no, it's ultimately just to get you high, because ultimately you have a bunch of people in these pictures that ultimately it makes no sense of how calm and cool that they are, like a Hindu cow. So we have it to where eventually Tyler gets after telling Cornelius that he works for a soap company. He ultimately realizes, or Cornelius realizes, that both Tyler and him have the same briefcase. I wonder why. So we ultimately have it to where Tyler is getting out of his seat, and ultimately he's questioning etiquette, uh, whether to shove in Cornelius's face his ass or his crotch. But ultimately, he moves on. So we ultimately have it to where the plane is now over, and it or the plane is now over. The plane has now landed, and ultimately we find out that Cornelius's luggage had been lost. He ultimately goes to baggage claim, and the baggage claimer ultimately says that there was a shaking and or vibrating of Cornelius's luggage. Ultimately, they break down that it's like, well, it could be like a razor, but there's sometimes where it could be a toy of sorts. Let's just say that, but they never want to claim that it could be his toy. It could just be anyone's toy. So anyways, moving on. So I don't quite understand why a vibrating case would get somebody's luggage taken away from them. But anyways, we have a tour. Eventually, Cornelius goes on his way to ultimately make it back to his hotel. To ultimately find that once he makes it to his hotel, that his hotel blows up. His apartment building blows up. Ultimately, to see his refrigerator and all kinds of other furniture just down on the ground floor. Ultimately, to mentions like a fridge full of condiments but no food. So ultimately, ultimately, Cornelius ultimately has, in desperation, needing to call somebody to stay for a night. Ultimately, at first, he calls Marla, and ultimately, he doesn't say anything to Marla, but ultimately, she says, I can hear you breathing you, and then he hangs up the phone. Ultimately, he calls Tyler, he doesn't know why. He hangs up the phone because ultimately the phone didn't pick up, and ultimately the phone ends up ringing. And of course, we have it to where Cornelius picks up, and it's Tyler ultimately saying, who is this? And ultimately, Tyler never picks up his phone. He starts 69'd him. And so, really, we have we have Cornelius that is explaining to Tyler, good grief, that, hey, you're never going to believe this. So, because ultimately he's convincing him, hey, like, you remember me, we were on the plane, I was a clever guy, you're never going to believe this story that I'm just going to tell you right now. And Q moving forward into this whole thing with ultimately uh, because I'm gonna skip the very beginning of this movie, just kind of skip a little bit of that. I ultimately can go back to it, but there's gonna be a reason why I'm not gonna go back to it. So we have it to where here is where Tyler is now in utter shock after hearing this story. Like, well, hey, like somebody could have just like chopped off your nuts and ultimately just kind of like left them on the side of the road. Could have been worse. So we ultimately have Cornelius like mentioning it's like, well, yeah, I had so many valuable things. Like I had a sofa. Like I always thought like if anything, if there was ever a problem, it's like I have that sofa thing down. And Tyler's just like, oh, well, you just lost stuff. You just lost a bunch of stuff. Whoopity doo. Like insurance will probably cover it. So, but ultimately, Tyler hits you with the things you own end up owning you. So, pushing on. So, we have it to where ultimately they are leaving this bar and we have to where Cornelius is ultimately uh, looking at his watch and like, yeah, it's kind of late. Maybe I should get a hotel. And ultimately, Tyler's like, you can't ask. Ultimately, Cornelius is like, what? It's like, dude, you bought me like a couple pitchers of beer and you can't ask me. And ultimately, Cornelius is like, well, could I like ultimately Tyler just goes like, well, like I know you were gonna ask me to like live at my place, like is and ultimately and ultimately Cornelius ultimately saying like, well, could I? It's like, well, could you ask? It's like, so we have this whole rigmarole of, and eventually Cornelius asks like, can I stay at your place for a night? And ultimately Tyler says sure. But the only thing is, the only catch is that now Cornelius has to hit Tyler as hard as he can. Ultimately, he's not afraid of scars, so ultimately, he just wants to let it fly, and ultimately, just like, yeah, just hit him as hard as he can. Ultimately, Cornelius hits Tyler in the ear, and ultimately, that's perfectly fine, so they just start fighting it out. So we find out where Tyler lives, and it's of course a hole. It looks like basically someone had already lived there. This place looks condemned, and ultimately it looks just awful. Uh, like it looks very disheveled, even to the point to where at some points they have to turn off the electricity whenever it rains. And so ultimately there are some kind of stuff that they kind of miss out on when when and if it rains at some portions of time and if so facto. So but we ultimately get to see them ultimately like be golfing in their front yard, just smacking golf balls wherever. So we have a tour ultimately that these fights at this bar or at the front of this bar keep going on and on and on. To the point that sometimes where ultimately Cornelius is going to his work, ultimately to have blood in his mouth, or ultimately just to be scarred up. To the point to where he is kind of really very much just like he hates his boss, and ultimately he hates that his boss wears a cornflower blue freaking tie. Because ultimately he's just a pompous So we have it to where eventually these fights ultimately just get more and more like, you know what? Like this is really something. Like it finally has to have a name. Like if it's on everyone's, it's on the tip of everyone's tongue. So like we just need to name it now. So they finally cement that they're going to be under Lou's Tavern and going to actually put on a real legitimate fight club underneath Lou's Tavern. So ultimately, of course, the rules are numerously said throughout this movie. Ultimately, the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. The third rule of Fight Club is a fighter goes limp, uh, gives up, taps out, the fight is over, and so on and so forth. There's so many other rules that ultimately I won't get into. Um, Two guys to a fight, and one fight at a time, and so on and so forth. In the video game, I kind of thought it was interesting because they really play to those rules much more so than I think the movie does. Uh, Also, I think one of the rules was no shoes and no shirt. Uh, Anyways, so going on into there, so and of course the last rule is if this is your first night at Fight Club, you have to fight. So we have it ultimately to where they fight it out, and we find out some interesting characters that ultimately go through these fights. Ultimately, we find uh, like some kind of like side characters that ultimately we could talk about at some point and be interested by. So eventually, we're going along into here, and we eventually have seemingly more and more people joining this fight club to the point where even Robert Paulson eventually is seemingly a member. He kind of gives up being with men together, and ultimately he ends up joining the fight club. Ultimately, mentioning to Cornelius when he meets him, hey, what are you doing now? Are you still men together? And ultimately, Robert Holson's like, no, I tried something new. And the first rule is you can't talk about it. And the second rule is, and Cornelius is just like, look at me, I'm a member. Like, I know what you're talking about. So ultimately, we have it to where Robert Paulson ultimately goes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Cornelius goes on Saturdays. So ultimately, we have it uh, to where eventually Cornelius fights Paulson um, to ultimately just kind of kind of get another fight in, and so on and so forth. So we have it uh, to where pushing on. So we end up finding out Tyler Durden's career, which I thought was really fascinating. We end up finding out that Tyler ultimately he edits films. Ultimately, he splices if there's not enough reel for like certain transitions of certain kind of films, which I'm sure is completely different now. It's probably all digital or whatever, but we have these little transitions in between Act 2 and 3, where ultimately they need to get reels, and so we have it to where Tyler ultimately just adds in one reel of some like adult content like movie between Acts 2 and 3, uh, to ultimately uh, make it to where the snooty cat and the lovable dog ultimately uh, end up meeting for the first time, and then all of a sudden you'll see a splash of Tyler's work, which is a adult movie that ultimately shows a big Johnson right in front of the screen. Ultimately, they'll see a flash of it. So you have it to where ultimately, uh, like a flash for a second. So you have it to where all these kids and this family and stuff like that are all going into a movie to see a nice little kids film, and then all of a sudden they'll get a splash of something that they shouldn't see, and you just have the kid. You just have the kids that are in the theater that are all like, oh, wow, I didn't want to see that. So it was just hilarious. So we have it to where ultimately Tyler also is a waiter at some dining place, that I think is incorporated with a hotel. So ultimately, we find out that Tyler ends up going and tampering with a lot of people's food, like farting and peeing and all kinds of stuff into everyone's food. And ultimately, I'm just like, God, that is so disgusting. But when looking at it, like, who knows what people might have been doing with people's food at some point. Anyways, so we eventually have it uh, to where we find out all the jobs that Tyler does, and on top of that, he makes soap. Is his real job. He ends up selling women's fat butts back to them, and ultimately he goes out to make soap with Cornelius. Because ultimately they have to go and go to this place that ultimately they have to steal uh, fat. They have to steal uh, uh, plastic surgery like fat. Like they have to like steal it and make soap out of it. So they ultimately make soap and ultimately they sell it off. So eventually, while Tyler is showcasing how to make soap to Cornelius, eventually he kisses him on the hand and ultimately then pours a chemical over Cornelius's hand, and ultimately tells him to let go, like just let go. Ultimately, we have it to where Cornelius is ultimately getting a chemical burn, and this freaking hurts his hand, to where he's trying to desperately jerk away from Tyler, but Tyler is holding onto his hand really strongly. And ultimately, I think Cornelius is looking for water, but Tyler says like water won't work; it'll make it worse. Ultimately, you need to pour vinegar on it to ultimately get rid of the burn or kind of take the burn out, but it'll still be there. You'll still see it forever. So ultimately, Cornelius says, "You don't know how this feels," and ultimately, Tyler shows his hand that ultimately is the lips are on it. So we have it to where Cornelius is desperately trying to uh, figure out how to deal with this pain like ultimately cancer patients do by going going inside their brain and finding their spirit animal. And Tyler's like, don't do that crap. Like, come on, live in this moment. And so ultimately we have it to where Tyler is just like, you need to know that like the world hates you, and ultimately and this and that. And like we have to where ultimately uh, to where Tyler is just like telling him to let go, and ultimately, uh, so Edward Norton does exactly what Tyler says, and so ultimately pours the vinegar over him, and he's completely fine. So we have it to where eventually Marla is ultimately calling Cornelius. Ultimately, after the police officer had called Cornelius, mentioning that it seems that his apartment had been lit on fire by dynamite. And so ultimately, the police officer is asking, like, has anybody tried to kill you? Do you know of anybody that would try to kill you? And ultimately, like, Edward Norton's like, all my stuff is really valuable stuff. Every stick of that furniture was me in there, so on and so forth. Hand him the Oscar. So we ultimately have it to where after that call, Marla is on the phone, ultimately talking about the numbers of pills that she has taken. Because ultimately she is she's a person that is kind of seemingly going to try anything to really just get attention, really. So Marla is ultimately calling Cornelius, and Cornelius is just like, dude, I just don't have the time to hear this hear this crap. where she's just calling me, like threatening me that she's going to die soon. And so ultimately, while Cornelius could not give a single F, we have it to where ultimately Tyler is ultimately picking up the phone and making his way to Marla's place, which ultimately I don't quite understand how exactly he knows exactly where she lives, but mood point. So eventually, we have it to where Tyler makes it to Marla's apartment. Marla's like, "Oh, did I call you?" And so ultimately, we have it to where uh, Marla is mentioning that she needs to be uh, awake all night, and so ultimately we have it to where Tyler is putting his elbow upon a dresser that ultimately seemingly has a interesting toy upon it. To ultimately he is like he's looking at it, and Marla's like, "Oh, well, like if anything, that won't do anything for you, or that won't, like, what does she say? Like that won't do anything to you, or something like that." So we ultimately have it to where it seemingly people are gonna bust down the door of Marla's place to ultimately save her from ending her life, and we have it to where Tyler and Marla get out of that apartment before the cops ending up coming. So we have it to where Marla is making fun of her own self while these cops are going in there. Um, and so Marla and Tyler run off to go to Tyler's place, ultimately to do some bedroom business repetitiously for I don't know how freaking many days and I don't know how long. We have it to where Cornelius eventually goes into coming home to ultimately just finding these two going at it, and to the point where it's just like non-stop, like every time that he is home, he's ultimately just hearing them going at it, and he's ultimately like, dude, I probably could have gone into a different room where I couldn't have heard it, but like every single time, like I'm just like I just can't avoid it. So we ultimately have it to where ultimately every time besides them banging away, uh ultimately we have it to where Marla and Tyler aren't in the same room together coincidentally. If anything, I'm kind of quickly probably forget about a lot of the points in which that they have to talk about, like who would they fight, who would the famous people that they would ever fight, like Gandhi and Lincoln and stuff like that, and William Shatner and so on and so forth. Um, I'm gonna probably skip all that. Ultimately, there is also one scene where ultimately Tyler ultimately is in a bath, and he mentions about him calling his dad, and ultimately like trying to get wisdom from his dad. And every time that he calls up his dad, ultimately mention like, "Hey, Dad, what do I do next?" He's like, "Well, get a job." "Hey, Dad, what do I do next?" "Well, get a wife, get married." And ultimately Cornelius's character is like same. It's like ultimately uh like they're not ready yet to get married, and so ultimately like Tyler mentions like, well, like we were men raised on women, and so ultimately I don't think another woman in our life is something that we absolutely need. So pushing on, so we have it to where ultimately within this fight club that this escalates. So we ultimately have it to where Lou ultimately comes down to meet Tyler, ultimately to say like, hey, Irvin ultimately had gotten his ribs broken, so ultimately he's at home. So Lou is making his way to ultimately check out his bar to ultimately find out that there's a fight club underneath it. So Lou goes down to ultimately meet Tyler, and ultimately Tyler mentions how Lou and his security guard need to join their club. Ultimately, Lou asks, like, well, how much money is Irvin getting from this bar? And Tyler says, free to all. So we have it to where ultimately Lou is ultimately demanding that uh, that because ultimately Tyler says, hey, I want you guys to join our club, wouldn't it be great? And eventually we have it to where Lou is just tired of hearing what Tyler is saying, so ultimately he just starts punching him and punching him repetitiously to the point where Lou is telling him shut the F up. And because ultimately Lou is ultimately threatening him. It's like, hey, like you guys got to get out of here. And ultimately Tyler is egging him on, just going like, oh, is that what you're telling me to do? Is that what you said? He's like, yeah. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? And he's like, you know what? I don't think so. I don't quite think so. And so that's where we have Lou just starting to light him up with punches, and to ultimately, Tyler gets so repetitiously just punched to eventually his head seems to be bleeding. To ultimately we have it to where Tyler, ultimately when Lou thinks that Tyler is done, Tyler grabs onto Lou and jumps on top of him and just starts like flinging all kinds of blood all over his body, all over him, freaking him out. And ultimately just like, you don't know where I've been, Lou. You don't know where I've been. To the point to where Lou is like, oh my god, like this guy's insane. And Tyler is desperately begging for them to please keep the basement of the bar so they can continue their fight club. Ultimately, begging him to keep the bar, and Lou says, "Well, on my mother's urn, you can keep this bar. Like, do whatever you want. You're crazy. You're insane." So Lou goes away, and ultimately Tyler demands all of his men to ultimately go, okay, each one of you have an assignment. You're going to start a fight, and you're going to lose. So we have a tour. We have a kind of a repetitious scenes of people starting fights and getting into interesting fights going on here. And this is to eventually showcase that eventually more and more of these people are going to start something more than just Fight Club. Eventually they're going to start a Project Mayhem. So, and I like this part. I ultimately like how it's just kind of like, oh, well, like it becomes more than just Fight Club. It becomes something bigger um, than just Fight Club. But I think the bigger portion of it just kind of goes like off the rails and to utter insanity. But it is what it is once you get enough numbers and you get enough people all wanting to be a part of this Fight Club. So we have it to where ultimately Tyler is to have these people start Project Mayhem, to ultimately having at some points them trying to do these projects and stuff like that. And like at first off, it kind of like starts small where they're ending up like just taking bats to certain people's cars, or ultimately having a ton of birds all crap all over these cars in this car dealership, or ultimately they end up kind of putting magnets to VCR uh, VHSs, which ultimately make the VHSs mess up to where you can't play any of the movies. So pushing on, so eventually we have it to where because ultimately I'm kind of skipping the whole point of them trying to get initiative people to do Project Mayhem. Uh, the whole point of Marla eventually talking to Cornelius, and while that is going on, Tyler is ultimately making bunk beds for all the people of Project Mayhem. So we ultimately have uh, we have to ultimately pushing on to the fact that every one of these members have to stay outside of Tyler's home for 3 days, which I thought was interesting. To the point where they're getting like shovels and rakes and stuff like that and just beating the living crap out of them, and ultimately telling them that they're too blonde or they're too fat or they're whatever their main thing is. Like ultimately, just tell them that they're too something. They're not qualified for this or whatever, to just kind of push them into not doing it, which I thought was interesting and I thought was fun. To where it's like you get to the point where they're taking rakes and shovels to hit these guys to ultimately tell them to go home, and they're ultimately telling them it's like, "Hey, I will call the police. Like, don't mess with me. I will call the police," but that's a lie. To ultimately see if they will leave, and they don't. So we have it to where eventually more and more people eventually go on to here. To ultimately, it seems that Tyler is feeding them the riot act or the Bible of sorts to ultimately kind of get more and more people into here. To where every single person is added. Ultimately, is now talking about some of the stuff that wanted them to be a part of this. To ultimately, it's like. Ultimately, Tyler is mentioning it's like you are not your job, you are not your wallet, you're not your khakis, you're not your this, you're not your that. To the point where even at some point where uh, Tyler had pulled a gun on a gas station attendant, ultimately to ask him like what did he want to do with his life. And ultimately, this gas attendant said, "I wanted to be a veterinarian, but there was too much school." And so ultimately, we have it to where eventually Tyler tells him it's like, well, hey, I'm gonna steal your license. Pause here for a second. All right, so ultimately, we have to where Fight Club is being established, and so ultimately we have, or Project Mayhem is being established. We have it to where ultimately guys are ultimately getting their knowledge of, hey, like this is the reason why I joined, and so on and so forth. We have to where eventually Cornelius is kind of going into his home, realizing that eventually they had done some projects without him knowing. And so ultimately, we have it to where Tyler is getting his, or Cornelius is getting his feathers ruffled because ultimately he's not aware of things. And ultimately, pushing on for Tyler to be talking to Cornelius in this car and after this fight club because he's not aware of things. And so we ultimately have it to where Tyler is mentioning as they're driving off in this car that they took. Ultimately, Tyler is asking the two guys that are ultimately with Project Mayhem, ultimately asking, "What would you do? Uh, what did you want to do before you died?" And ultimately, one guy mentions build a house. The other person says paint a self portrait. So ultimately, we have it to where uh, Tyler is wanting to ask Cornelius what his level of involvement is in Project Mayhem. Like, should we email you? Should we put this on your action item list or something? And so ultimately, Cornelius wants to be known of things. So ultimately, Tyler is mentioning how Cornelius doesn't know anything at all, even what is actually the thing between him, like between Tyler and him, that ultimately he doesn't realize even what he knows about him and Cornelius. So we have it to where Cornelius is ultimately just like, what do you mean by all that? What do you mean by all this? And so we ultimately have it to where Tyler is ultimately telling Cornelius to just let go, ultimately let the wheel just turn wherever it wants, because ultimately Cornelius is taking the wheel and like, what are you doing? And Tyler's saying, let go. So we ultimately have a tour. Tyler ultimately crashes his vehicle and having a near life experience. So we push on even more. So eventually it gets to where they are ending up putting a project together that is to uh, seemingly do two birds with one stone, and ultimately they find out while doing this Project Mayhem that ultimately while they ended up having cops chase after them. Ultimately, that ends up getting Robert Paulson killed, and to ultimately they have to bury Robert Paulson. So you ultimately have it to where Cornelius finds Robert Paulson's dead body, and ultimately he's like, "Hey, this guy had a name," and so that's when they say, "Oh, well, in death, uh, people of members of Project Mayhem have named, and his name is Robert Paulson." So, and they repeat that over and over and over again. So, to ultimately later on, they showcase it again. So, pushing on as much as we can possibly push on in this movie, uh, we have it to where ultimately Cornelius is eventually starting to more and more start to eventually put things together. To eventually have it be that Tyler had threatened some kind of a political figure, that ultimately there is no Project Mayhem, and ultimately uh, to like snuff him out, told me tell him it's like, hey, if you're going to come out and ultimately say that this thing exists, then ultimately we're gonna come after you and snip your balls. So pushing on. So now is when ultimately uh, Paulson was still alive. So pushing on into this movie. So we ultimately have Marla, who's mentioning like, hey, what are all these people at this place? Cornelius is like, well, it's a soap company, and ultimately Cornelius is mentioning that Tyler is no longer there at the company, or no longer, like, he's not there for Marla, because ultimately Tyler had left. So we have it to where eventually Tyler is going and trying to figure out like what the heck, where did Tyler go? Ultimately to the point to where he's flying everywhere. He's flying to any number of any different kind of states that ultimately have opened up fight clubs, to the point to where eventually we have it to where uh, at some point when going through all these, we eventually have a guy uh, that is behind a bar, ultimately talking about that he had seen Cornelius before, and that ultimately he had talked about how security was, and security was tight as a drum, and ultimately that Cornelius actually was Tyler Durden. It seems like a lot of times Cornelius would get confused with Tyler Durden, but ultimately now, like, Cornelius has kind of cemented it. That it's like, what did you call me? Like, your name is Tyler Durden. So we have it to where ultimately uh, Tyler ultimately calls Marla to ultimately ask if they've ever made love, and ultimately that's when Marla finally cements that, like, yeah, they have made love. And ultimately she's talking about how crazy he is and how nothing ever makes sense with him. And we have it then to where ultimately Tyler appears out of nowhere, ultimately with a shaved head now. And ultimately we have it to where Cornelius is like, how can anybody confuse me with you? And that is where we have the hook here. Of course, per usual, legendary hook, where ultimately Tyler says, how can anyone confuse you with me? Because you and me are the same person. Ultimately, there's a lot of times where Cornelius assumes that ultimately he is seeing Tyler, but when all actuality he's actually seeing himself, ultimately in a different viewpoint. Uh, anyways, he is actually doing all the stuff that Tyler was doing, and so ultimately he is actually the leader of Project Mayhem. He has he has so many jobs because ultimately he cannot sleep, and so ultimately he just that's ultimately him just kind of he has nothing better to do, just do all these jobs. He ultimately has a house made out in his name, Cornelius's name, and so on and so forth. So Tyler is ultimately now telling Cornelius that ultimately Marla knows too much, and so ultimately the next move is ultimately to take Marla out. So we have it to where once Cornelius is awake, he's ultimately trying as quickly as possible to make his way back to uh, to his place, or ultimately just to get to Marla to tell her that like, hey, like you need to leave, you need to try to get out of all major states and everything like that. But ultimately, Avatar Marla ultimately goes on a bus somewhere to not really go anywhere. She just ends up going right back to where ultimately Tyler wants her to be. Because ultimately, we have it to where basically Tyler has his hands into everything. To the point where ultimately uh, when Cornelius goes to the police, ultimately the police are actually members of Project Mayhem. So we have it to where ultimately uh, uh, we have to lay out Tyler's plan that ultimately he needs to go and bomb a bunch of buildings that are to set the credit back down to zero. And to ultimately, there is no debt, there is no whatever. So we have it to where all these bombs are all planted within these buildings to make credit go all the way down back down to zero. And so reasonably now we have the seemingly chasing all over town to ultimately try to take down these bombs. We ultimately have it to where Cornelius finds where these bombs are and ultimately tries to disarm them, and that's when Tyler, of course, appears to ultimately try to stop Cornelius from defusing a bomb, but he does so successfully. But then Cornelius, or but then Tyler rearms the bomb and then closes uh, the van ultimately to get shot at by Cornelius. Ultimately, for Tyler to mention, it's like, dude, you're shooting at your imaginary friend next to a van laced with nitroglycerin. Do you know how crazy that is? So we have it to where Tyler ultimately just has to beat the crap out of Cornelius and ultimately gets him into the building that he needs him to be in so he can be safe, and ultimately puts a gun to his mouth. To ultimately, the very beginning of this film um, preludes to this moment. To ultimately, we have it to where Tyler mentions like, "Well, do you have anything to say?" And in the beginning of this movie, Cornelius says, "Well, I can't think of anything." And then when we come back to this moment, Cornelius says, "I still can't think of anything," as flashback humor. So we have it to where ultimately the bombs are all set, and there's nothing that Cornelius can do. But it seems that Cornelius is coming up with the consensus of that uh, that really Cornelius and him are the same person, and ultimately uh, Cornelius hates that Tyler's voice is in his head, and Tyler's mentioning it's like, well, yeah, but your voice is also in mine. It's like so we have it to where Cornelius is trying to figure this out, and he is trying to get Tyler to stop all this, and Tyler is like, no, like I'm not going to go backwards. Ultimately, like we've accomplished so much with what we've done, so I'm not going to go backwards. So it's not going to happen. So we have it to where ultimately Cornelius makes it a consensus that if Tyler has a gun in his hand, that Cornelius has a gun in his own hand. And so Tyler's like, "Oh, hooray! Yeah, look what you did." It's not going to change anything, but then ultimately, uh, we have Cornelius putting a gun to his own mouth and eventually pulling the trigger, and ultimately, it seemed that Cornelius lived where Tyler died. So we have it to where eventually the members of Project Mayhem come in here, and we have it to where ultimately Marla is going like, "What the f?" And then ultimately she's seeing that he's shot, and ultimately she's trying to take care of him. Uh, Cornelius is mentioning like, "Hey, maybe we need to get gauze." It seems like a lot of people are just kind of like, "Wow, like he shot himself in the head and he lived. What a strong mother." So we ultimately have a tour. These buildings are all coming down, and we have a tour. Cornelius mentions it's like, "Hey, you met me at a weird time in my life." But ultimately, it seems that Cornelius had cemented that he does love Marla, but like Marla is like was so weirded out by what was all going on that ultimately she didn't know how to feel about Cornelius. But anyways, that's all I wanted to say about Fight Club. Really trying to get this review out there and try to get it all done and whatever. There's probably a lot of stuff that I tried to skip just for saving time. But let's otherwise talk about Close Calls. So, Close Calls is a very goofy film when really going through and watching it. Because recently, when looking at it, the only real selling factor is just the fact that we have a girl named Jordan Phillips who is Morgan Mackenzie that is basically in a bulk of this film with basically just her lingerie on. I guess that's the real just selling factor of this film. Other than that, there's not much really going on with this story, with the exclusion of there seemingly being a guy that tends to just like talk his way into this house, and that ultimately backfires on our main character Jordan. So ultimately, this movie is there are some maybe gross out points that ultimately people might just be like, eh. There might be some points where a lot of people would probably guess or second guess why I would have seen this movie more than once and review it more than once. Um, I just think reasonably it was an odd movie that at the end of the day it just stuck out to me to where I ultimately just needed to talk about it again. In the end, it's probably not the best movie, but F it. It's just like it's one of those where I'm just like, there's maybe a reason, or there may be a reason for why any guy would probably want to watch this film. So go ahead and check it out, even though it's quasi bizarre at some points. This movie. But anyways, so yeah, recently I thought, if anything, this there's some interesting parts about this story, but really there isn't enough story, or it's just kind of like the story is just kind of like what is going on. Like there's a lot going on with this story. There's a whole like thing about Morgan's dead mother, and also having to take care of her estranged grandmother, that ultimately her grandmother is very gross and or weird. There's a part where ultimately you have it to where her grandmother is like coughing up blood and all kinds of other stuff that's really gross. So ultimately, when you kind of get to the grandmother parts, just kind of watch out to be grossed out is what I would probably say. Um, Other than that, you have it to where ultimately Morgan is consistently just like trying to get as high as she can possibly get, to the point where it seems that she is also tripping really bad as well. To where she like is having some bad trips and having some bad times, and justifiably she's getting really scared as well. So yeah, I thought that this movie there was some interesting portions of it, uh, but recently at the end of the day, I'm not gonna go out of my way to recommend anybody watching it. Because ultimately, anybody would probably watch this movie like, why? Why watch this movie? I've seen a lot of weird, bizarre-ish, like, films in my day. I've seen a guy's face who ends up, God, what is it called? Uh, I think there was one movie where it ended up having a guy who had a piece of bark being like put onto his face. I don't remember what the movie was called. Um, but ultimately, there was like a guy who had like a tree trunk being like put onto his face, and you just have like an entire movie of that going on. And I just thought that that movie was utterly absurd. But when looking at it, there's a reason for watching that movie as well. Um, I want to say it's like Plank Face or something like that, something along those lines. But it's a weird movie. Ultimately, while also looking at like Survivalist, which ultimately I really enjoyed, but that really it has a very small story as well. But anyways, so let's go into just spoiling this movie. I'm gonna try as humanly as quickly as possible, just kind of bash through this review. Because ultimately this one will be like, man, who cares? Who cares for this movie? But when looking at it, there might be some visually interesting reasons at some point within this movie to watch it, I guess. So let's go into that double five to otherwise talk about this movie. It's very weird. So let's go into it. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we ultimately have it to where Morgan ultimately is grounded. She seems to be a fairly old girl, but ultimately she's just grounded by her father. Her father is ultimately is remarrying, I guess, refinding a woman, and we ultimately find out that uh, that within this movie that this Morgan is grounded, and ultimately she is supposed to take care of her sick grandmother because ultimately the father won't pay to get a nurse or whatever. So we have it to where the father is ending up leaving for the night to ultimately go and dine with his girlfriend, and ultimately Jordan ultimately is going to one try to take care of her grandmother, but then again she's really just trying to take care of her own self by ultimately she's making her grandmother the soup that she wants, but ultimately like Morgan is just trying to get as high as humanly possible to the point of eventually having her boyfriend kind of sneak into her home to get her even more drugs, and ultimately we have it to where ultimately Morgan's boyfriend, which I don't see the thing of, the caller, businessman, yeah, not seeing it. Anyways, Morgan's boyfriend comes on in, and ultimately we have it to where while Morgan is getting high, it seems like Morgan's boyfriend is almost taking advantage of her and basically doing a little bit more than massaging her at some point. Um, because ultimately he is getting, of course, high as well. So it seems that eventually that Morgan is starting to hallucinate and having nightmares until ultimately she is like really freaking out about all the drugs that she's having, but ultimately she just keeps taking more. So eventually we have it to where eventually her boyfriend leaves, uh, because ultimately we have it to where uh, the reason why Morgan is grounded because ultimately her boyfriend had come over before, and ultimately the father had walked in on Morgan and her boyfriend just going at it. So ultimately, he grounded her for that. So because ultimately it's his house and it's his rules. So we ultimately have it to where Morgan eventually is to uh, take care of her grandmother, but it seems that eventually one of uh, Morgan's dad's co-workers ultimately ends up coming to Morgan's home, and she's not quite sure if ultimately this is a real person or not. But anyways, so Morgan, because she doesn't know what is real, she's just kind of like so high off her kite that she's kind of like, So we have it to where this man named Barry is coming to the door of Morgan, ultimately to mention that he is a co-worker of Morgan's father's, and ultimately she's like, hey, and he's like, hey, like, I just want to be able to talk to your father. I was hoping that I could come in here and be able to talk to your father. And it's like, well, he's gone right now. And you have it to where Barry's like, well, hey, you know what? Like, I could wait like I can wait in the house until he arrives. Like, I'm sure it's not going to be too long. And ultimately Morgan has to mention, it's like, well, hey, how did you get in here through the gate? And Gary mentions like, well, the gate was already open. Like Gary's making all kinds of number of excuses of like how he can try to get into the home. And ultimately Gary's like, yeah, I know all this sounds kind of really weird, but hey, like, just please let me into your house. Like, if anything, it's getting really wet out here, and like I would just really like to just be into your be in your house to meet your father, to kind of talk about work and stuff like that, and just call it a night. So we have a tour. Morgan lets Barry in, and what a mistake that was. We ultimately have a tour. Barry has to take off of all of his clothes because ultimately all of his clothes are very soaked. So we have a tour eventually. Barry ends up taking some hooch of David's, ultimately Morgan's dad, and we ultimately have a tour eventually. Morgan is mentioning how it seemed that Barry and David's new girlfriend, Brian or Brian, Brynn, Brian. I want to say Brian. Brian, I could be wrong about that. Her last name is Collins. That's probably easier to say. So Morgan mentions how Barry and Collins are ultimately together at some point, just kind of sneaking kisses and stuff like that while David is not around at the office. And Barry's like, you know what? I can't I'm like, there's no way that I would be trying to put anything between uh, you and your dad's woman. There's no way. And ultimately Morgan's like, dude, I've seen you. Like I've seen you. Like the jig is up. Like I know that you've been having an affair with my father's woman. Like I've seen you. So we ultimately have it to where the jig is up, and ultimately Barry is ultimately just grabbing onto Morgan and ultimately forcing her to do whatever he wants. Ultimately, that gets to the point of uh, like Barry basically saying at some point that he's going to have his way with Morgan. Also, weirdly enough, Morgan before all this was getting these creepy phone calls that ultimately were hilarious to me because every single time she would answer the phone, it would just be some guy going, like probably beef jerking it uh, to Morgan bizarrely, ultimately kind of mentioning that they were going to be together and this and that and all kinds of weird crap. And to where the point is that eventually Morgan eventually calls her father saying like, yeah, I've been getting a lot of weird phone calls all night. And these are freaking like weird phone calls. And so David eventually wants to finish the date early because of Morgan and all these weird phone calls. So, and ultimately, the dad at some point was assessing that it could be her boyfriend, and that ultimately her boyfriend is pulling a prank on her. So moving on, we eventually have it to where Barry eventually uh, is taking a tied up Morgan to the bathroom to go pee, and while she is going to pee, Barry is going to look at her and be able to play with his fiddle, let's just say. And ultimately, while that is going on, eventually, while Barry gets distracted, we have it to where Morgan eventually stabs Barry and runs out. Uh, we have it to where ultimately. Uh, we have it to where Morgan eventually runs out to meet both David and Collins, and Morgan ultimately asks Collins, "Is like, was this your plan all along? Was this your plan to ultimately try to come after me and my father?" Because ultimately, we have it to where Morgan is mentioning that Barry was here, and ultimately. Uh, he was there to try to kill Morgan, and ultimately I think he was there because ultimately he wanted to finally confront David for cheating. And so we have to do her to where David and Collins are ultimately now like arguing of like, well, is this true? Like, have you been cheating around on me, and so on and so forth, to the point of where eventually Morgan has to be confronted, or Morgan has to take David and Colin's bathroom where supposedly Barry was, and Barry is now gone. And ultimately, uh, David is trying to say that all this isn't true, but ultimately he's still going to confront Collins to ultimately ask if this is true, if they are, like, at least if the cheating is all true. So we have a tour eventually that Morgan is uh, eventually she is leaving ultimately to come back to find that that uh, that Collins had killed David. And ultimately, yeah, this was the plan for them to eventually kill these people to have Collins like keep all the money and everything like that. Because ultimately, David was a rich guy. So we have it to where ultimately David is now dead, and ultimately Collins and Barry are both going after Morgan, and we eventually have it to where Morgan eventually takes out both Barry and Collins. We have it to where uh, ultimately, like Barry is taken out first, because ultimately what ends up happening is that uh, Morgan ends up running back into the house after finding her father dead, and eventually we have it to where Morgan is eventually going to the house, ultimately get slung around by Barry. She ends up crashing into this coffee table, which ultimately you can figure out where that's going, where ultimately leads to her to get a piece of glass and stuff like that, to where ultimately it ends up to where easily you can ultimately stab Barry and kill him. Uh, After that, we ultimately have it to where Morgan is making her way ultimately to try and uh, hide from Collins, and we ultimately have it to where ultimately the grandmother ultimately saves Colin, or saves Morgan, by intercepting Collins and just kind of eating her, or ultimately just like the grandmother's like eating her, or ultimately trying to bite her, or uh, and that leads to seemingly this girl's death. So we have it to where Morgan is just like she is heavily been panicking from all of this fiasco, all of this craziness, to the point seemingly where like it feels like she's probably having a heart attack from all of this, from one taking all these drugs, but then eventually like just all this craziness that she's had to deal with. So it seems that at some point we have it to where ultimately, bizarrely, Morgan is in some kind of bizarre state where ultimately she is completely 100% undressed and just kind of walking around this kind of very demonic or disheveled house, to ultimately lead her into uh, waking up wearing her grandmother's clothes. Ultimately, to the point of where Morgan is locked in her grandmother's room, ultimately to not be able to get out of this, to ultimately we are just led to believe that Morgan has died as well. And that is where the movie just kind of concludes, with ultimately just being like, okay, well, um, seemingly, uh, interesting enough, it seemed like also the spirit of David's wife and or Morgan's mother ultimately seems to arrive at some point in this movie, but we can't really make heads or tails of it. It seems like, interestingly enough, the photos are consistently changed, if not like modified consistently, to where we see the faces consistently shift, and I think that that's kind of a funny kind of thing. Um, but yeah, but we're just led to believe that ultimately everybody had died, with the exclusion of probably the grandmother, and the grandmother had been able to uh, just be able to get out of this unscathed. But other than that, yeah, very weird movie, very baffling movie at some points, but meh, it was a movie nonetheless that I ultimately had seen. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to say about this movie. It's really like, when looking at it, like, I thought it was kind of funny. Also, they had like the Batman like 66 phone, like the red phone that ultimately would be calling people. Because ultimately, I guess this was a movie done by landlines and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, but I thought that it was really interesting. Well, you kind of had to do the whole landline phone thing because ultimately, Morgan's phone was taken from her because ultimately that's what she was grounded from using her phone. So, anyways, yeah, interesting movie, but at the end of the day, that's all I wanted to say about it. That's all I wanted to take the time. So, anyways, I'm going to grind my way out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.